Egypt just threatened Israel in a pretty significant way. But does it mean anything? Let's watch this video and find out. All right, folks, let's get into this. As you know, I have quite the interest in any of the articles that directly relate to Egypt, especially as it sort of associates itself with Israel. As many of you know, my mom and my dad were both born and raised in Egypt. I was raised speaking Arabic as a second language, and so much of these geopolitics are really familiar to me for a lot of different reasons. But this article caught my eye. I'm going to read it to you, and it is very interesting. By the way, this article is found in JNS, which there's a lot of very interesting articles you could find there. But let me read this to you. We'll get into it, and we'll start having a conversation about all the different geopolitical implications of what we're reading. The article says this. It says, Egypt threatens to axe treaty with Israel over Rafa operation. Now, let's get into this. It says this: Egypt has threatened to suspend its 45-year-old peace treaty with Israel if the latter further expands its offensive against Hamas in Rafa. Cairo has lodged formal protests with Israel, the United States, and European governments following the Israel Defense Forces invasion of eastern Rafa, which was launched last week. It goes on to say an Egyptian official cited by the report who spoke on the condition of anonymity said the operation has put the peace treaty at high risk. The peace agreement with Jerusalem is a strategic choice, Egyptian Foreign Minister Samah Shoukry told reporters later on Sunday. He goes on to say peace has been Egypt's strategic choice for 40 years, and it represents a main pillar of peace in the region to achieve peace and stability. Turkey State News Agency is what actually reported this. By the way, I just want to say this before we go on reading the article, because this is kind of important. When he refers to the idea of this being a very strategic choice, you have to understand it's a lot more than a strategic choice that Egypt made. Egypt was, in essence, forced into establishing this peace treaty with Israel because there was no real alternative. They got their rears kicked by Israel, and of course, Egypt knew that if they continued forward with some type of continued war with Israel, it would not be good, especially when all Israel is asking for is for them to acknowledge their right to self-determination and their right to actually be a state. Also, let me just simply say this. Egypt is not hurting as a result of what it did with respect to Israel. As a matter of fact, Egypt has become a significant beneficiary of the peace treaty that it actually signed with Israel for a whole bunch of reasons. And we don't even have the time to get into all of those reasons. But let me go on reading this because this gets really, really interesting. It says this. It says, also on Sunday, Egypt announced its intention to formally join South Africa's lawsuit against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Cairo said the decision was made in light of what it called the worsening severity and scope of Israeli attacks against Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip and the continued perpetration of systemic practices against Palestinian people, including direct targeting of civilians and the destruction of infrastructure in the Strip and pushing Palestinians to flee. Israel's war cabinet on May 6th decided to continue the operation in Rafah to extend military pressure on Hamas in order to promote the release of our hostages and the other goals of the war. Okay, I have to say this because this is really, really important. First of all, you have to understand that there were a lot of people initially who were very upset by the idea that Israel's war cabinet made the decision to continue pressing on in Rafah. But you also need to understand that although there was a lot of talk over the idea of Hamas coming to some type of a equitable ceasefire agreement, they did not agree to any such thing. As a matter of fact, they had no desire to cooperate with Israel and continued to state their intention of wanting to see the Israeli state destroyed, okay? So this is like really, really important. Israel's hand here was forced. The other thing that I should say is when it comes to Egypt, not everything is as it looks like, right? What meets the eye isn't necessarily what's going on, and we'll talk about this because it is very, very important. It goes on to say this: Israeli troops took control of the Gaza side of the Rafa crossing with Egypt the following morning, as tanks from the IDF's 162nd Division's 401st Armored Brigade rolled up the border station. The Rafa operation, which Israel estimates will last around 2 months, is being carried out in phases as opposed to a full-scale invasion. The phased nature of the operation allows for it to be paused should a hostage release deal be reached between Israel and Hamas. On Thursday, the cabinet voted unanimously to expand the action after the IDF encircled the entire eastern sector of the Hamas stronghold in preparation for the destruction of the group's remaining battalions. Okay, so let's just talk about this for just 1 second, and we'll get into the rest of this article. But you have to understand that what is being done here in Gaza is absolutely necessary in order for Israel to accomplish its purposes. If they don't, it gives Hamas an opportunity to regroup, and all kinds of things come as a result of this. And there's a lot more on this to come. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Matter of fact, we may not even have time to talk about it in this video, but we will deal with some videos specifically addressing the issue of Rafa and the problem that Israel is facing in wanting to deal with all of this. Okay, let me read this next paragraph, and this actually comes from Al Qahira news outlet, which reported this on Sunday, but it says, for the past week, Egypt has refused to coordinate with Israel to allow aid to pass through the Rafah crossing. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi decision is preventing aid trucks from passing through the border. Now, why is that? Why is it that if Egypt was sympathetic towards the cause of Gaza, that it would not allow all of this stuff to go through the border? Well, I'll tell you why. Because Egypt recognizes the same thing that Israel recognizes. Egypt recognizes the same thing that the rest of the Middle East recognizes, and that is, if they open up the door for something like that to happen, then they open up the door for tons of harm to take place to their own people. And if you don't believe me, take a quick look at this video right here. And the translation is actually very, very good, of a truck driver that actually tried to go into Gaza to help out in the situation. This is an Egyptian truck driver, and look at what he says. And by the way, what he says here and what you see is not graphic in that you're not seeing any person being injured, but you will see evidence of what actually happened here, and this says a lot. So let's watch this really quickly.
وزي ما انتم شايفين كده العربات اتكسرت ما عادش نافعه. طوب من جوه خرم الظهريه، وده دم السواق. زي ما انتم شايفين الكابينه ما عادش نافعه. شوف بدل العربيه اخر بهدله ازاي، والسواق جاي مضروب ومتبهدل. اتفضل اتفضل. ادي الناس بتوع غزه يا سيدي.
And the translation, by the way, on that is actually very, very good. And this is just one very small picture of how Egypt looks at the whole thing. As a matter of fact, that's really interesting when you think of al-Sisi and you look at the picture of what happened in Egypt even recently. He just recently pushed out the Islamic Brotherhood, which, by the way, for those of you that might not know, which most of you already do, the Islamic Brotherhood is who created Hamas. Hamas came from the Islamic Brotherhood. They were around a lot longer before Hamas was actually created. And of course, you have to understand that Egypt wants absolutely nothing to do with Hamas. Egypt wants nothing to do with Gaza. The moment they let go of Gaza, many years ago, is the very moment that they wanted nothing to do with it, because they want to protect their interests to the north of their country. They also want to protect their interests in areas of the Sinai, like Sharm el-Sheikh, and they have no desire to see any trade or potential trade routes disrupted. So they're taking all of this very seriously, and this is the real reason why they don't want anybody from Gaza anywhere near them. They do not want Palestinians or Hamas anywhere near them, because they understand what everything is going to actually end up resulting in. They know this, and they know this very well. As a matter of fact, let me show you this picture. This is a picture of the Egyptian border at Gaza, on the southern part of Gaza, and at the northern border at Rafa. Take a look at how extensive this border wall is. Unlike the United States of America, this border wall is designed to make sure nobody gets across. And there are very serious people on the Egyptian side that are making sure that nobody gets to even be anywhere near it, because they know what happens when Palestinians cross the border in Gaza. They saw what happened, of course, to Israel, and they know, of course, what's going to happen to them. And by the way, this is not just the thought of Egypt. This is the thought of Saudi Arabia. This is the thought of many other Arab countries. If you don't believe me, Look up what happened with Jordan and what happened with Lebanon and all the things that took place even in there. When you start beginning to examine the history of all of this and you see the destructive force that gets pushed in the way that it is getting pushed, you will understand the position of Egypt. So many of you might be looking at this going, my goodness, well then if Egypt feels this way, then why are they saying what they're saying? Well, this gives us a little bit of a hint because this gets really interesting. It says this. Next paragraph, it says, Jerusalem wants to allow humanitarian aid for Gazan civilians through Rafa, but is unable to do so without Egyptian cooperation. Cairo has previously also warned Israel against taking military action in the buffer zone along the Gaza-Egypt border, known as the Philadelphia Corridor. Video footage shared by IDF troops last week showed them raising a massive Israeli flag in the 8.7-mile long border area. Okay, now why does Egypt not want them to be anywhere near there? Why does Egypt not want them to launch any attacks? Really simple. Because if that happens, then it opens up a potential liability for Egypt in continuing to maintain security in that portion of the border, and they want nothing to do with it. They do not want to be in a position where they take refugees. They don't want to be in a position where they accept Palestinians. They want nothing to do with it. Look at the next line in this paragraph. It says, Egyptian officials have repeatedly made clear that the country will not accept any Palestinian refugees from Gaza, declaring it what? A red line. Now look at how they spin this, guys. This is important. Egyptian security sources dismissed proposals to allow Palestinians to flee, with one saying Cairo would not allow safe corridors so as to protect the, quote, right of Palestinians to hold their case or their cause in their land. Now that makes a whole lot of sense, but understand the way that they're spinning it. I can tell you this right now, it really puts the real picture together. You see, they're saying that they don't want to allow anybody from Gaza, any Palestinians into their country, because by doing so, it gives them an opportunity to abandon that area, and then the Israelis have victory. Then the Palestinians will actually lose their land. Well, we know that nothing could be further from the truth, because even when there was a ceasefire prior to October the 7th, Egypt had a very serious policy about who they were allowing to enter, especially in through Rafa and this Philadelphia corridor. You have to understand this. It's very, very significant. Egypt took it seriously and continues to take it seriously. Why? Because they remember Shuair Tahrir during the time of the Clinton State Department. They remember Benghazi. They remember all of the implications that took place there. And they certainly remember the fact that actually Anwar Sadat was assassinated by the Islamic Brotherhood in the early 80s. So this is not anything that they don't know. This is not anything that they're not familiar with. Folks, this is the big, bad, ugly world of the Middle East, and Egypt understands it. And look, I said this about Saudi Arabia, and people thought, oh, James, you're crazy. There's no way in the world Saudi Arabia is going to, on any level, seek to normalize with Israel. Well, they've already said it. They've come out with it. They said, yes, we've already normalized with Israel. It's a matter of when we're going to do the formal announcement. And let's take it a step further. Saudi Arabia just made a law. You guys saw this earlier this week. Just made a law that pretty much made it illegal for anybody in the kingdom to speak against what is going on with Israel or to speak ill of what happened on October the 7th in terms of against Israel. Why? Because they're normalizing with Israel. And why are they normalizing with Israel? Because they have their eyes on the G20 and they have their eyes on the G7. Mohammed bin Shalomeen talked about this in an interview with Brett Baer. There was a conversation where he actually mentions this, and he speaks about his desire to want to become a lot more effective in this area. Let me show it to you right now. It's a very powerful section of this video, and it's really, really important to understand his mindset behind wanting to produce economic benefit. So look at the question that Brett Baer asks the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and look at how articulate his answer is and what he says. Because again, this relates to the subject of economic forces driving this whole thing, right? And look at what he says about the G20. Look at what he says about his desire to see economic strength in Saudi Arabia and across the world. Watch what he says here.
Can you give us some specific examples of what your goals are and how you think all of this is going?
Well, simply, we have in the past few issues in Saudi Arabia and a lot of opportunities that we didn't use. We're trying to capture that and to go forward for a better Saudi Arabia. And that's what we're trying to do.
And it's a big vision.
It is a big vision, and we get like surprised every day that we reach our target faster, and we extend that to a newer target and a bigger ambition. So it's really exciting.
Your ministers say you work them hard.
Well, you can see in 2022 we are the fastest G20 country growing, and also in this year, if you take just the non-oil GDP part, we are the second fastest in the G20 growing. So it's like a fight between Saudi Arabia and India, a good fight.
You're making a transition on trying to get different parts of the economy, not a heavy reliance on oil. The role of women in the society has evolved significantly. You know, you had this 2030. What do you see 10, 20, 30 years for Saudi Arabia?
Okay, listen to the answer that he gives. You've already heard him talk about G20, and I'm going to get into this because this has a lot to do with Egypt. I'll get into this in just a second, but listen to what he says here, and then we'll stop and I'll explain why this matters with respect to Egypt and what this threat that Egypt gave Israel really means. We'll talk about it in a second.
I will give you an example. If you look to late 70s, Saudi Arabia GDP is bigger than South Korea, and now South Korea, I think it's the 10th or 11th largest GDP in the world in 2016, and in 2016 we are number 20. So that's a shame. In 1980, we was GDP number, I think, 12 globally, and then in 2016 we are number 20. So we believe if Saudi Arabia and really the perfect track, since that time we will be among the top 7 GDP globally. I'm trying to get Saudi Arabia back on the right track.
So basically, he's saying that his goal is to get Saudi Arabia back into the G7. I mean, that's in essence what he's saying, because he's looking at the GDP, he's comparing himself to other nations, and he really is being driven by the economic benefits. This is why Saudi Arabia, even in the midst of this war with Gaza, has basically stated its intention to announce that they have already normalized with Israel. And by the way, this is the same reason why this threat that Egypt issued is in essence an empty threat. You need to understand that Egypt has to do this because Egypt has security concerns where it is seeking to maintain somewhat of a status quo that exists, especially in the northern portion of the country as it relates to the southern corridor of Gaza, because if they don't do that, then how in the world are they going to save face in approaching future negotiations using the Palestinians as yet another tool to achieve what they need to achieve? The reality of it is they are following the cue of Saudi Arabia in many ways because they know that Saudi Arabia is going to have a significant effect in helping them with some of the problems that they're facing, especially as you go further south along the Nile into Aswan and you start dealing with Sudan and what's going on with Libya. That's to the west of Egypt. And you get further down, you begin to see so many of the crises that they're beginning to face, especially when you start going north and of course to the east, when you deal with the Sinai, when you deal with the area of Sharm el-Sheikh, when you deal with the area of the Red Sea, and when you start dealing with the problems that they're facing with the Suez Canal. They know that with all of the instability that they're seeing, especially in Yemen and Djibouti and Eritrea and all these other areas leading up into the Red Sea, they know that their trade opportunities that they used to have are going to literally die a terrible death. And the only way that they can fix that problem is by following the lead of Saudi Arabia in normalizing with Israel so that they can create the natural land bridge that they need to in order to move all of the goods that would come from places like Pakistan, India. And really, I think that MBS is more concerned, the Crown Prince is more concerned with India specifically. Why? Because they will cut right across the Arabian Sea, go into this area of Oman, and from Oman through the UAE, take this massive land bridge all the way across north and go above. And if they end up working some things out out with Jordan and Iraq, there is a real potential for them to be able to really solidify some serious trade. And don't get me wrong, they're working with Kuwait already. They're seeking to be able to develop their understanding of what's happening a little bit better in between the Tigris and the Euphrates with the construction of this new Babylonian city that they're pretty much talking about. This is all stuff that Egypt sees themselves as having an opportunity to be a part of. And let's not underestimate Egypt also seeking to want to solidify their relationship with Russia, understanding fully that Russia is in the midst of helping a civil war in Libya, and knowing fully the fact that Russia will solidify their position in Libya, which of course creates a whole lot of issues for a lot of people in the Mediterranean, specifically in the southern Mediterranean. So there's a lot of stuff to be thinking about and a lot of stuff to be looking at. But what I can tell you right now is that we are dealing with an empty threat. Egypt has no desire to enter into any kind of war with Israel, and actually has no desire to even put into danger any type of peace treaty. And the reality here is they know that Israel will continue to treat them well, while they do not know that the Palestinians will, which is why they're taking the position that they're taking, and which is why they're having to navigate all the issues going on in the Arab world. But I can guarantee you, behind closed doors, Egypt has the exact opposite attitude. We know it, we can sense it, we hear the talking amongst the people, it's all there, and we need to wake up to understand what's really going on. So there it is, folks. And understand this, you got to know this. This is really, really important. The Bible makes it clear. Israel's not going anywhere. Jeremiah tells us this, right? The Bible tells us this. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt what God's plan for the nation of Israel is. God never gets it wrong. His word is true. We should remember that and never forget it. Why? Because God knows better than us. So what do we need to do? Trust him. Look, we're in the last days. We need to wake up and understand what's happening. Study the word like we've never studied it before. Trust in God for all of the things around us and pay close attention to what's going on in that part of the world. All right, there you have it, guys. God bless you. Lots more to talk about. There's a lot happening. Love you guys.